who can't be present this evening. So without further ado, David, over to you.
Okay, good evening, Alan, and to everybody, as they say on the Israeli radio all the time, l'kol ha'ma'azinim. So everyone who's listening in. The wonders of globalization. I'm sitting in my home in the south of Israel in a community called Meitar, where I've lived for well over 35 years, and speaking to you from here. But as some of you know, I visit the UK a fair bit, if not only to see my football team, but also for my real work in geopolitics. I have a lot of joint research interests with universities, particularly with King's College. And over the past few years, I've become very interested in a completely different area of work, which is the history of Anglo-Jewish communities, personalities, stained glass windows, which I'm very interested in, particularly the Hillman windows, and the various synagogues. And as I move gradually into retirement over the next year or two, I'm probably going to spend more and more time working on these topics. Now, it's not going to be an academic lecture I'm going to give you tonight. I have a PowerPoint here, which I got rid of half the slides today, and I still have far, far too many to show you in the space of 45 minutes. But you're going to see a lot of pictures here. You'll hear me in the background, but there are a lot of pictures, and I'm going to just have to rush through some of the slides. But I need to make a few of my own personal introductory comments. One is to say this is as much about personal history and nostalgia as it is about research. I grew up in the Anglo-Jewish community. I grew up in a family where both my family and my wife's family were full of UK rabbis. Let's say over the past 100 years, there could have been anything from 12 to 15 of them. And if each of them went through 2 or 3 pulpits in their life, it means that we've had personal connection with anything upward of 30 or 40 synagogues in the UK. And I'm probably going to, without even thinking about it, say more about those ones that I know. And I want to apologize in advance for everybody sitting here, because everyone out there is going to say, why hasn't he spoken about my synagogue? For everyone I speak about, there are probably another 3 or 4 in the category. And I apologize for that. And I'm very open to questions and discussions or more information at the end. And also to receive information and pictures from people. As Alan said, a few years ago, I started a site on Facebook called the Synagogues of London in the UK. Started with the Synagogues of London, and it spread. And some of you may know the site, and it has over 1,000 people linked to it, both in Israel and the UK, and also around the world. And every so often, someone puts in a picture of an old synagogue, an old rabbi, a community, and there are always interesting comments and discussion that come up. I mean, this is when we look at the pros and cons of many of the modern forms of communication. I think it's a very positive way to use Facebook as such. But I don't apologize for being very nostalgic, not just being a professor, but being nostalgic about some of the topics I'm going to talk about. And on a number of occasions, I'm going to throw in a personal anecdote about something that may have happened at this synagogue or that synagogue, a synagogue that no longer exists, because I think it has to be interesting, entertaining, and bring a few smiles to faces of people who remember. The front page that you see here has 2 pictures of paintings on the side. Many of you probably know the series of paintings by Beverly Jane Stewart, who's a member of the St. John's Wood Synagogue. So on this opening one, you see 2 paintings from the Beverly Jane Stewart collection. She's an artist, a very talented artist. She's a member of the St. John's Wood Synagogue. She's now gone on to other things, but she has a series of about 15 or so of these paintings of old synagogues, which has actually come out in a catalogue and even been displayed at Beit HaTfutzot in Tel Aviv. And here you see 2 of the majestic synagogues of the UK. The Egerton Road Synagogue on the left, which is now, we're going to talk about that a fair bit, now the place for Bobov Hasidim. And on the right, the Hammersmith Synagogue in Brook Green, which is now a church. But a lovely set of paintings. Anyone who's not seen them can probably find them online. Of course, synagogues are not always majestic. You can have anything from the New West End to a little house in Kiverdale Road in Stamford Hill. I didn't want to show the other window of that house because it was rather anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. But of course, people pray in many different sorts of places. And we're going to look more at the majestic synagogues, even though many people will say it's more comfortable and homely to pray in these little houses and shtila, from cathedrals to steeples. This is roughly the sort of topics I want to go through. It's far too much. I'm going to just spend a few minutes saying something about data sources, because I'm sure there are people here who would like to follow up on their own interests and research. Say something about my own personal interest, where it came from, by talking a bit about the United Synagogues of North East London, and then really get into the hard part, the heart of the presentation, and talk about this whole process of what happens, why do synagogues close, what happens when they close, and what happens to the buildings, to the artifacts. And hopefully I'll have 5 or 10 minutes left at the end to make some suggestions and some concluding comments, and even to hear a video at the very end. But obviously there's a lot here, and I'm not going to be able to do all of it in a 40-minute session. Let me just say something very briefly about the sources of information and data. I know there are people out there who say, oh, you know, we don't know enough about Anglo-Jewish history. There's always more to be learned. But actually, there's a tremendous amount of material out there which has been published as books, increasingly material online. And there are tremendous amounts of sources, most of which, not all, are easily accessible. We can start from the Jewish Heritage Europe, Michael Mail, and the Jewish Archives, the LMA, the London Metropolitan Authority, where all that list of archives, United Synagogue Board of Deputies, Office of the Chief Rabbi, the London Beth Din, Federation, Jewish Memorial Council, and other organizations, all have their archives there. In the last few years, thanks to a Rothschild Foundation grant, they've been catalogued so you can look up the sort of files you want online and be ready when you go there. It's free to go and access. But of course, there's far too much material for it all to be digitized. So you have to eventually go and find the file that you're looking for. But as I say, cataloging has helped it. If you do want to look at the United Synagogue Board of Deputies, Chief Rabbi Beth Din, you need to get permission from the various people at the Board of Deputies or at the United Synagogue. I would make a plea, if there is anyone listening to me tonight who is part of those, I would make the plea to say, let's cut that level out. I know the LMA would really like to have just open access. There's not a huge amount of confidential material of living people left there. And there are United Kingdom laws which restrict you from looking at personal files which are less than 100 years old. But there's a wealth of material there, both for personal family research, community research, and for serious PhD researchers. I mean, it's just a treasure trove there. It's the sort of place you go looking for one topic, then finding something else, and suddenly finding you've spent 2 days just enjoying yourself looking at other files without ever having got to what you actually wanted to go for in the first place. If you look at number 4, another very important project is the Jewish Gen, JCR UK, David Schulman, who is a retired lawyer from Britain, now living in Ra'anana, who over the past 10, 15 years has been building up meticulous material about every single Jewish community that ever exists in the UK. It's a never-ending project. He's always adding material. And to the best of my knowledge, there are now cross-links between the JCR UK and the Jewish Heritage Europe. Again, just go into JCR UK and you'll almost certainly find material about the community that you grew up in. Very important project which Dawn Waterman has been running for the last few years. She's been trying through the Board of Deputies to just have a site where all these archives can be accessed in one place. So you come to one side and link on and try and find out as much material as you can instead of having to search for all of them up front. Those of you who don't know, probably the second most important Jewish depository in the UK after the LMA is the James Parkes Archive at the University of Southampton. There's a long story about why it was at the University of Southampton, who James Park, a Philo Semite, was in the 50s and 60s at a time when we weren't keeping archives. And there's a huge amount of interesting material there, not easy to access unless you go there physically. And you can see many, many other forms. Good old field work means walking around like you see me in the picture there at the old remaining pillar of the Dalston Poets Road Synagogue, which I'm going to talk about. United Synagogue, I think, is now more careful about how it looks at its assets and heritage. And they have a very able person, Miriam Marson, who's now the heritage officer, many community books, newspaper archives like the JC, and there are a lot of experts out there. I saw at least one of them when I came online, David Jacobs. There are a lot of experts out there on Jewish heritage who know a lot more about it than I do. And I suppose the number one to do with synagogues and architecture in England is Sharman Kaddish, who has written a lot and produced a very important book on synagogues. You have Kenneth Collins and David Kaplan, who are experts on Scottish Jewry, Nathan Abrams on Welsh Jewry, Neil Grizzard, originally from London, on Leeds Jewry, and so on. You have a number of people out there who are walking encyclopedia. There is a gentleman called Charles Tucker. I don't know if he's still working with the United Synagogue, but he was in charge of the archives for many, many years. And his only problem is he's not into computers and digitization. So he knows everything in his head, which of course is not the best of situations, but he knows everything. And those of you who read the JC will know that Simon Rocker over the years has written a lot to do with communities in the UK. And of course, there are many personal memoirs, personal memories, personal community memories. They can be often very selective because you find that maybe their fathers or grandparents were chairmen or presidents of synagogues. They kept the archives in the attics of their houses, and maybe they kept the parts, they didn't publish the parts, which may not have always been the most positive in what they want to get over. So obviously there's a lot of selective community politics involved. But the bottom line is there's a lot of material out there. Most of it is accessible. And those of you who are interested in looking at this material, there's a lot to go on. And I'm very willing, if you send me emails, to help you get into that material. That's an example of the JCR UK, which has all the synagogues, all the communities, all the records there, and the Jewish Heritage Europe, which deals with heritage throughout Europe, but has a special page or a special section on the United Kingdom. There are a number of books about synagogues in Britain and Ireland. I suppose, Bible of the synagogues in Britain and Ireland is Sharman Kaddish book. There are two books on the lost synagogues of London, or the synagogues of London. I'm going to focus not 100% on London, but it's going to be largely focused on London because that's the place I know best. But obviously you'll see there are a lot of provincial communities coming to this discussion as well. The book on the right, The Lost Synagogues of London, is my personal Bible. It's a tremendous book. It was produced by Peter Renton in the early 1990s. He collected amazing information there, given the fact there wasn't then internet or Google searches or digitization. And I've been threatening for a number of years to do the second version of that book because so many synagogues have closed since. Unfortunately, Peter passed away a few years in his 50s, just after the book was published. If you want to get a hold of a Lost Synagogues of London today, you go on eBay, and if you're lucky, you may find one for about 200 or 300 pounds. It's almost impossible to come by. And I was delighted, many of you may remember or recall one of the British community's great civil servants, Alan Greenbat. When he passed away a few years ago, he left me many of his Anglo-Jewish books, including another 2 copies of the Lost Synagogues of London, which I gratefully gave as presents to people who did very important things for me. One of them being another ex-Brit in Israel who actually was the moil for one of my grandchildren. But it's a tremendous book. You should look at it if you're interested in the history of synagogues in London. There are a huge number of community books. I've just put a small selection on here. This is about a quarter of the selection I have at home. They cover everywhere and anywhere: Manchester, Wales, Edinburgh. What someone called Gil Fillan is doing writing on Edinburgh is interesting, and Ireland, Plymouth, you name it, Grimsby, Bayswater. I could go on and on. There's a lot of material out there. Some of it is very academic. Some of it is a bit dry. Some of it is very informative and entertaining. You take what you get in these books, but there's a huge amount of material out there. So I move on from there to say my own personal interest in this topic started because I suppose I was taking my children, who are now quite grown up, and with kids of their own, we're going back 20 years, taking them on family history trips to England. And I always started by taking them to the Dalston Poets Road Synagogue, number 2 on your list, because that's where I grew up, where my father was the rabbi from the late 50s to the late 60s. And we started from there on a walk, which I often take people around when I'm in London, from there up through Highbury, through Clissold Park, through Stoke Newington and up to Stamford Hill, and talking about my own personal and the history of that area, which of course was then not as Jewish as it was pre-World War II, but was still quite Jewish at the time. And then I started getting interested in more and more of these places. If you look at northeast London, and you can see that over, I should say number 6 at the end, of course, that over since the late 50s, that's 50 years, 60 years, there are 6 very major, what we would call cathedral, grand synagogues, which all belong to the United Synagogue, have closed. We can start with looking, and it's very interesting, if you look at the first 3, North London, Dalston, Shackwell Lane, they all opened 10 years after each other at the end of the 19th century. They all closed roughly 10 years after each other in the 60s and 70s, after a life history of a bit less than 100 years, of 80 years. And if you look at them very closely, this is the area in London. Some of you may be familiar with it. Newington Green is at the middle there because that's where Dalston was. And you can see they're really not very far from each other. And when, as you'll see in a minute, there are a lot of other synagogues, not just the United Synagogue, Federation, Adas Yisrael, Stieblach, all in that Stoke Newington, Stamford Hill area. It was, of course, and it remains, Stamford Hill today is the largest Haredi community in Europe, the 3rd largest in the world. I understand it's way past the 40,000 mark, and it's virtually 90% Hasidish, unlike when we grew up at the time when it was very Litvak at the time in the 60s. And you can see number 1 is the Angel Islington, Lofting Road. Number 2 is Dalston. Number 3 is Shackwell Lane. Number 4 is Egerton Road. Number 5 is Hackney. And there's Stepney a bit, really, it's not really in that area, but it was a bit large United Synagogue, which also closed down. North London, that's what the shul used to look like. Lofting Road, beautiful shul in the middle. It was eventually demolished with that block of flats. And just a few years ago, thanks to the good efforts of a young Chabad rabbi who's now working in this area where there's quite a renaissance of young Jewish professionals coming in, a plaque was put up on the block of flats say this is where the North London Synagogue stood from 1868 to 1958. The shul I grew up in, at Dalston, that was the synagogue. I lived there from the age of 2 to just before my bar mitzvah. Obviously all of these synagogues had a bet midrash where they davened every morning because these synagogues were far too large to use during the week. And dare I say, I can in retrospect now say it without getting told off, it was great to bring my friends in and play hide and seek in these beautiful buildings and these beautiful shuls, a perfect place for it. I found the picture on the left actually in the archives of the Finsbury Islington Library when I was mooching around there one day. That's what it looked like just before it was knocked down in 1969, 1970, and that's what there is on the right just now. Islington actually Mendicora has just recently received a very major heritage grant from the Mayor of London to do a Jewish heritage tour for Islington, and we're trying very hard to put a similar plaque on the block of flats or on that pillar that you can see there next to the blue van, because interestingly, that pillar in between the flats and the houses is a wall and a pillar which remains from the synagogue itself, something I'll come back to. But the reason being that the synagogue was built in about 1870 or 1880, and the houses were from the 1930s. When they came to knock the synagogue down in 1970, they found that the side wall was the supporting wall of the houses, so they had to leave it there. And when I start my walking tours, I often ask people, can you see something strange here? Some people will notice that there's a strange wall there which doesn't really fit into either building. We're hoping that they will be able to get a plaque or a heritage plaque put on that pillar as well. Not far down the road, when Dalston closed, we walked over to Shacklewell Lane, which was, by the way, Poets Road was called the Dalston Synagogue. It was never really in Dalston. It was in Highbury, Canonbury, but it was called the Dalston Synagogue. And so when Shacklewell Lane opened up, they weren't allowed to call themselves the Dalston, because Shacklewell Lane is really in Dalston, right by Ridley Road Market. And there you can see the Shacklewell Lane shul, which closed 10 years later. And if the other two were knocked down, by the time Shacklewell Lane came along, they were getting a bit stricter about heritage laws, and it's changed its function to a mosque. That's what it looks like today inside. Anecdote, I remember a few years ago, I was walking around there and I poked my head in there. I didn't have a kippah on, so I sort of poked my head in, and there was a 17-year-old kid cleaning the place. And I said, oh, this is a beautiful building, isn't it? And I said to him, do you know how long it's been a mosque? And he said, oh, at least 100 years. So that's as much they know of the history, but you can see the structure of the shul remains very much in there. Egerton Road was the next one to close down. Egerton Road was, of course, itself a replacement of the great new synagogue of the East End. It was built in Stamford Hill in 1915. Closed later. That's a beautiful old shul. Our very last slide, if we have enough time, will be a 3-minute video about the closing of Egerton Road. And that today, at least, has remained within Jewish hands. It's now owned by the Bob of Hasidim, who poured millions into doing it. They were told that they have to leave certain things in situ because of heritage laws, such as the Hillman windows, such as the plaques for the royal family. I sometimes manage to take people in there, but you can see who their audience is today. The bottom picture is actually Diane Dunner giving a hesped. Last year, when Rav Kanievsky died here in Israel, and this was now the largest place for any Hasidic gathering in Stamford Hill. I say they left the Hillman windows there, but actually there's another big window at the back of Egerton Road, which was not a Hillman window. It's from the 1960s. And they had a problem about this window because it had the symbols of the state of Israel on it. And they weren't very keen on having that in their synagogue. So for a number of years, they covered over the back window from inside with a big sort of not cardboard, wooden sort of wall. And when I was there about 3 years ago, I suddenly realized the back window was showing. It was no longer covered up. And I asked one of the Hasidim there, what's happened? He says, look carefully at the window. And I looked, and I realized that 2 of the panels, I'm not sure it was exactly done with permission, had been replaced. And the panels showing the symbols of the state of Israel no longer appear in that window. He also told me that he has no problem with having the prayer for the royal family up the front. The Hasidic community are very reverential towards royalty and the royal family. He did just say with a wink, they wouldn't mind replacing the name of the then Queen Elizabeth with the name of the Bob of Areba. But nevertheless, it still retains its majesty, even if the old furniture has gone, and the mechitza, as you can see up the top, is a very different mechitza to the one that used to be in the Egerton Road Synagogue. And we move on to East London, Stepney Green's a very famous picture here of a marriage taking place there. Again, that building remains, but is now a block of boutique flats. You can see it's called Something Court, but the main structure of the synagogue remains as it does when you enter into the sort of entrance and the lobby of the flats. And one last one, Hackney, Brent House Road, is now actually an evangelical church. I don't know because I can't see who's participating now. I don't know whether my good friend, Reverend Cousin Steve Kotzen, a childhood friend, is watching this. But if you are, Steve, there's a picture of you as a very young cousin there performing in the Hackney Brent House Road Synagogue. All of these were large, majestic synagogues in a very small area, all of which have been closed down. The first 2 were actually demolished. The other 4 have remained on site, but have all changed, functionally changed. And actually the main part of what I will say in the second part of this presentation is about the functional change within synagogues. It remains to say that in that area, many other synagogues existed, maybe not so majestic, some of them still very beautiful. Clapton Federation, Lee Bridge Road, the Montague Road base of Medrash Dalston, where my great-grandfather was a rabbi in the early part of the last century, at the back end of Ridley Road, Northwold Road, Stoke Newington, which was originally a church, became a shul, and you'll see later what it's become now. It's where we used to go for cheder in the evening in the 60s. The Adas Yisrael still exists, but it's moved its locations. Grove Lane has become the Vision Space of Medrash. This is the movings of the Adas Yisrael in northeast London. It started actually in Newington Green Road. I don't have any pictures of that, but then a synagogue was built in Burma Road, just off Green Lanes. You can see the top 2 pictures. Then it moved to Queen Elizabeth Walk at the other end of Clissold Park at the back of the Avigdor School, which I attended as a child. And that's actually synagogue still exists today, the one in Queen Elizabeth Road. But now the main Adas Yisrael community is Diane Dunner's community in South Tottenham, just south of Egerton Road. 2 houses you can see in the bottom right. The picture you see on the top right is very interesting. That little building still remains in Burma Road. And again, it's one of those places where when I'm walking through the area, I show people, and it actually remained functioning long after the shul closed down as one of the places for tahara, for purifying and washing the bodies before their funerals for the Adas Yisrael. Now it's no longer used, and it's been turned into a little student or boutique block of flats. And I don't know what happened to the unfortunate person who, when I was showing it to some people, came out and asked me, what's so interesting about this building? And I said, do you live here? And he said, yes, I'm a student. And I said, you know, this is where they used to wash and purify the bodies. I think he got a bit of a shock, and I don't know whether he remained living there or not afterwards. But that little building is still there at the corner of Green Lanes and Burma Road. And the Lampard Grove Lane, or what was Lampard Grove, became like Egerton Road. It's in the heart of this big Hasidic community, is now part of the Vishnitz Hasidim, Hasidic community. There is on a number of years ago, someone did a series of short walks around London, and he interviewed 1,000 different Londoners about their London. And I can't remember which number, but if you copy down this link, or I can send it to you, you can see the 3.5-minute walk I took through the area I've just been talking about. It's much more interesting to see the whole 1.5 hour raw material. And if anyone is interested in it, about my, walking through what used to be Jewish London for me, I'd be very happy to send it to you. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, now let's get on to the second main section, and let's look very briefly at what happens when a lot of these synagogues close. What is the process that takes place as these synagogues close? They change functionally, they may be demolished, all sorts of things can happen to them. Historically, of course, communities started in the inner city and they moved out to the suburbs. So shuls were closed down, not necessarily because of decline, but because people moved on. There is also demographic decline. In the beginning, they try and merge with each other, amalgamate. Many of them close at the end of the day. The premises are sold, which often is a very problematic process. There's always going to be members of the community who don't want it to be closed, don't want it to be sold. We'll go to the courts, we'll go to the Heritage Center and try and get them listed. That causes a lot of machlokas, local opposition of sales. Old premises, when they close down, are often neglected. I'll show you pictures of synagogue neglect, maybe today less so than in the past, but nevertheless, functional change of premises. Some have become flats, some have become schools. Churches and mosques are very popular because they are places of worship. If you turn one place of worship into another place of worship, you don't need to have all sorts of zoning applications, which you need for any other functional change. So they're very popular for churches, and particularly mosques in inner London. Others have become retail centres, theatres, offices, but in all of them you'll often see the retention of some of the structure, some of the features of the old synagogue. Some are demolished, as we saw previously. Some simply relocate to new sites. Some regenerate. I'll show you a few examples. What happens to all the religious and ritual artifacts? And if I do have a few minutes at the end, I'll raise some questions about how do you determine community priorities. On the one hand, you don't want them destroyed, you don't want them neglected, but on the other hand, how much can you fund the preservation of old synagogues just for the sake of preserving, however beautiful, when maybe that money should be going to other purposes, like the education of the next generation? It's an open question. It doesn't have a clear answer. And so going through that list, I give you two examples of Dublin and Newcastle. Communities have moved on. Those of you who know the history of the Irish community, from Woolworth Road to Adelaide Road to Greenville Hall and to Terenure, which just recently has been in the news because some of the members want that to close as well. And there's a bit of a discussion. It hasn't been finally decided, but there's discussion going on as to whether Terenure should close or not and have a smaller synagogue. Newcastle, another place I have a strong association with. I did my PhD in Durham at the end of the 70s. There's no Jewish community there. Even by then there wasn't. I just got married. So I lived in Newcastle in Jesmond for 3 years. And my first place of marital residence 44 years ago was next door to the Jesmond Synagogue for 3 or 4 months. We found another apartment. But there it went from Ravensworth Terrace to Leazes Park Road, which was shut by the time I got there, but was a great location because it was exactly opposite St. James's Park. And the older people would say, we used to love going to Leazes Park Road, have a long service, a long kiddush, and walk straight into the ground for the game afterwards. No need to travel at all. Then Jesmond, which closed down Gosforth, the bottom right, it all amalgamated into a single more modern Gosforth community, and just in the past few months that has also shut down for an even smaller place as the community sort of dies. In the provincial communities, as in London, they've moved to the suburbs, but also what's happened in most of the provincial communities, Liverpool, Birmingham, Newcastle, you know what, there used to be 3 or 4 synagogues, came to 3 to 2, down to 1, and now they're on the last one. Glasgow and Leeds may have 2 or 3 left, but you know, they're all going in that direction as communities move on. I don't want to say decline, because that's a negative aspect. That is part of it. But of course, communities move on. The younger generation, if they want to affiliate, identify Jewishly, they'll move to London, to Manchester, to Israel, or even to America, but they won't tend to remain within the provincial communities. I had to put this one in because all the seaside communities have declined as well. We did love to be beside the seaside. Margate, no longer. Blackpool, no longer. Bournemouth has just announced it's closing, it's going to sell its premises. Brighton, not the beautiful Middle Road Synagogue, but the other one is also closing down. And anyone who's interested in the seaside communities should read this book by Pam Fox, Jews by the Seaside. It's about the hotels more than about the synagogues. And if I were you, like half the people I know have read the book, they all start from chapter 6, because chapter 6 is all about the food that was served at the hotels. Synagogues amalgamate, as you can see, lots of examples. I'm just going to rush through these. Look at the bottom one, Nelson Street Synagogue, formerly known as East London. It went through a series of amalgamations over time. Bells, Berditchev, Boros, Cannon Street, Chevra Shas, Commercial Road. Every few years, another one closed down. People moved out to the East End. So it merged and merged and merged and merged. And of course, even Nelson Street Synagogue is not functioning anymore. You can see the same in Ilford, in Hackney, in Manchester, just about everywhere. That's what happens as the communities decline and synagogues merge together. I had to put this one in because a few years ago, St. John's Wood, which is where I daven mostly when I'm in London these days, has had on its premises the Sachi Synagogue. It still does. In the Bet Midrash, they decided to amalgamate it. But for any of you who know your political, theological history of the Anglo-Jewish community will understand they rather put the wrong picture there in the newspaper image. I assume most of you understand what I'm talking about, because that is the old St. John's Wood Synagogue, now the New London Synagogue, which in the 1960s, when St. John's Wood moved to a new synagogue, was a synagogue brought up by the supporters of Louis Jacobs and became the New London Synagogue. So that isn't quite the one that merged with the with the Saatchi. Lots of press, go through the JC archives, put it in the name of synagogue, this Fulham to close, Dalston to close, West Ham, Cork, lots of stuff about closure of synagogues. And then they get to valedictory services. 2 minutes at the end of this presentation, you'll see part of the valedictory service at the Egerton Road Synagogue, about what is now nearly 30 years. And of course, there's a great deal of sadness. The shul fills up with past members as they come for the final service. The Sifrei Torah are taken out, and the building is, the term used is deconsecrated as such. Shuls are put up for sale. What else are you going to do with them? Unless someone's ready to take it over for another Jewish cause, but even then you have to buy it. So shuls are put up for sale. There's often a lot of argument about this. On the right, you have the Merthyr Tydfil example. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because that's undergone a very interesting process. But on the left, you see the Wembley United Synagogue has been going through this process just in the past year, 18 months. So synagogues are always up for sale. But there's a lot of hype about what you do when you sell them, what has happened to the synagogues. Montague Road became an area for a squat. Montague Road, Beis HaMedrash, it's now boutique flats. When Bobov bought over Egerton Road from the United Synagogue, things weren't going very smoothly, and they nearly went to court over the amounts not being paid. Liverpool, Greenbank Drive, a beautiful shul, nothing has really happened to it in the 10, 15 years, and it remains very deserted and neglected up to this very day. Campaigners try and stop it happening. A synagogue closed down, they try and take over, but you need resources to keep it. And those resources, and I'm not talking about small resources, large amounts of resources for communities to preserve synagogues which are not functioning as synagogues, and therefore selling has a lot of problems. In the case of Blackpool, members went to the court, and the first round of selling was stopped by the court. There was an agreement reached at the end, and it's now come back to be a block of flats, but within the old building, without the old building being destroyed. And you can see we're all part of Jewish communities. We know how heated we get about Jewish politics. And this is what happened in Leeds not so long ago, 2019, when one of the community presidents said that the demolition story is bunkum. And I think some worse words were used to describe the process. Not everyone wants to sell communities they've been members of for 20, 30 years. Question is, what is the alternative? Many synagogues, when they're left, are left in disrepair and neglect. On the left, you have the Greenbank Synagogue in Liverpool. On the right, you have what became of Merthyr Tydfil before it became, as we shall see in a minute, a heritage centre. This was the Dalston Synagogue where I grew up. The shul closed down in 1967, but the Newman family kept living on the premises until 1969. And so I saw this process of neglect taking place until eventually my father went to become the minister of the Barnet Synagogue, and within 3 months of moving out of Dalston, that building had been knocked down. It was probably the last example of real disregard and neglect of its windows, of its books and everything. Everything was just destroyed very quickly in that case. And it was sold for even then the measly sum of £12,000. And that site in the heart of Islington, particularly gentrified Islington of today. So they become the neglect. That's what becomes of these shuls. Whole series of examples, particularly in the East End. You can see what happens when things have been taken out and the shuls are left in disrepair because they haven't been sold, they haven't been changed functionally. It takes time, and a lot of very important artifacts left in disrepair. Cannon Street for a while became a clothes factory. Montague Road, Beis HaMedrash, there was a famous squat which had to be evacuated before they could move on. And you saw, as I say, these were pictures you've seen. North London was destroyed, block of flats built. Poets Road was destroyed, a block of flats built. Lea Bridge Road, this is the last picture I have when it was completely knocked down. I don't know if anything's been built on that site. This is from a few years ago, but just destroyed and nothing there yet as yet. Barking and Becontree, where my wife grew up, was a small shul. At first, it became a small church, and then it stopped being a church and it was sold. About 2 years ago, it was destroyed, and within a very short space of time, that block of flats had been built on the premises of Barking Synagogue. Many of the old synagogues have become flats. Montague Road, Stepney, Cricklewood and Warm Lane, Blackpool, they're just a few examples. These are already heritage, these are already partly listed, I think, and therefore they have to retain certain parts of the structure. They can't be knocked down and demolished, so boutique flats have been built within them. This is on the left, penthouse in Queen's Park Synagogue in Glasgow. High level of flats. Look at Jesmond to the right. Look at the level type of flats which have been, the outside remains exactly as you see it in that picture. The inside are apartments, and you can still see part of the synagogue structure there. Dean Street, Soho, has become a theatre. There's a sign on the walls. Northwold Road, which was a Baptist church, which became a shul in the 50s, only really was there for 30 years. As I say, we used to go to Eitz Chaim Cheder there in the evening, is now also a fringe theatre on the right. You can't really tell when you go in there. It used to be a shul or a church. And in this, I believe, is in Leeds. That's right, Nigel Grizzard gave me the information of one of the old synagogues in the centre of town, which has become the Northern School of Contemporary Dance. But if you look at the bottom right picture, you can see the original structure and the original seats have been retained within that theatre. Some become offices. You may remember the Finchley Federation in Redbourne Avenue, or the Brixton Shul. Finchley Federation belongs to the Wald Foundation, which of course is a very major Jewish philanthropic foundation, does a lot of funding in Israel as well, and Brixton become a centre of offices. Very common, as I said before, for shuls to be turned into churches or into mosques. Hammersmith was a beautiful large shul. Again, my wife's uncle and aunt were the ministers there for 50 years, the Reverend Sam Vennett, and many other shuls. I don't know why I've got one from New Jersey on the top right, maybe just to show you that, of course, what I'm talking about is happening in America all over the place, New York the same, South Africa, Australia, wherever these old beautiful shuls were built, and the same process, it's a similar process in most of these societies. I could have quadrupled the number of shuls which have become small churches or chapels. Here's an interesting one, Wolverhampton, which most people don't know much about. It was neglected. It then became a church, but within the church, you look at the bottom two right pictures, they still have the symbols, the elements of the Aseret HaDibrot and the Maged David in the roof. So it's very clear what this building used to be. This is, some of you may have seen on my synagogue site. I was so interested, and I wondered how many churches had become synagogues. I thought there were very few, and any of you who follow that site would have seen I've been inundated with men's shuls which were originally Methodist chapels or church halls, and they're all over the place, far more than I ever thought. But of course, Northwold Road, before it became a shul, was a church. Machzikei Adas was a chapel. I didn't know, but Sandys Row, which is still functioning, was a church, and many, many others. And the Central and North Manchester Synagogue. Shakur Lane, of course, then mosques. I added a picture in this one. If you look at the picture on the right, Rabbi Herschel Gluck, who, as you know, is very active in Stoke Newington and is very active in inter-community, particularly Jewish-Muslim, he sent me this picture some time ago of him speaking, this is about 2-3 years ago, in what used to be the Shakur Lane Shul and now a mosque. And he said to me it's probably the first time since the shul closed down that a Jewish rabbi had spoken in this building as some sort of community. You can see the police, some sort of community protection meeting. Machzikei Adas is a Muslim centre. Fieldgate Street, one of the last shuls to close down, is now being extended to the East London Mosque next door. My wife's cousin, Johnny Gradinsky, who until recently was the owner of Gradinsky Bakeries, rushed down there when they said it was closing and took the plaque off the wall, which showed that this was the site of the first Gradinsky bakeries in London. It should really be in a Jewish museum, but of course, this amazing thing that London must be the only major city in the Western Europe today which doesn't have a Jewish museum any longer, which I think is something which needs to be rectified as soon as possible. Bronsbury Shul, beautiful big cathedral shul in Chevening Road, is now a Shia mosque, and it already had those kapelot on top, but of course now they have Muslim signs and no Jewish signs outside. Mosques tend to keep any Jewish signs much less than churches do when they convert them. And as you know, there was a whole issue when Wembley Shul was being sold some time ago. Look at the difference in the two adverts on the right. It has been sold to an Islamic community group, but at the first time they had they were raising funds to buy it, and they had a former place of worship of non-believers, and much protest was heard about that. And within a few weeks, the adverts had been changed, and that had been taken out. But nevertheless, it remains now, or it is being transformed at this very moment, into a new Muslim community centre. Notting Hill Synagogue, my grandfather was a rabbi there, and my father grew up there, is now a gymnasium. But again, you can see very clearly the synagogue. Look in the gymnasium at the bottom right, see the Magen David, but it's been blocked out on the outside, so you can only see the Magen David from the inside today. My father tells me when he grew up as a kid, came to Mincha on Shabbat, there were only 8 people there, and he used to be sent into the antique market in Portobello Road, where every second or third trader was Jewish, and he used to have to chop 2 or 3 of them to make up a minyan for Shabbat Mincha. One has been changed into a restaurant. Lees's Park Road, the beautiful old synagogue in Newcastle. I don't know whether it still is like this, but for a while it was a major retail centre. It may still be today. Again, you can see the structure of the synagogue very clearly inside on the pictures of the right. Some have been schools. Adolis Hill, which is a very strange architecture, even from the outset, is now a Torah Tamima school. So not only a school, but it stayed within the Jewish community. Newcastle, which became that block of flats, but it had a 20-year period in between when it was part of the Newcastle High School for Girls within Newcastle, as I was taught when I lived there. As I say, so many of these buildings have gone through a number of changes over time, but retaining their external structure. More recently, heritage centres. Merthyr Tydfil, I'm sure many of you have read in the press about how it was deserted and neglected and has now become part of a Welsh Jewish heritage centre. I believe that the contents had already been discarded or moved on, and they had to bring contents from other closed shuls to be part of the new museum. I don't know if it's open yet or it's in the process of opening at the moment. Manchester, I apologise for not knowing enough about the Manchester synagogues, but one of the beautiful old shuls on Cheetham Hill Road has now been turned into the Jewish Museum in Manchester. If my friend who also lives in Meitar, Rosemary Eschel, is listening to this, I can't see who's listening, then she could probably fill you in on how that process took place and how the museum came about and what is in the museum today. Leicester has become a new heritage centre. I'm not sure if the shul still functions or it's only a heritage centre, but obviously brings people in from the Midlands to learn about Jewish life in a new heritage centre, and so on. There's shuls that have been relocated. I've completely run out of time, so I'm going to rush through the last few slides. Apart from the one in the East End becoming a Muslim centre, of course, it relocated to, is it Highfield Gardens or Heathfield Gardens in Golders Green, where it functions as a small shul. St John's Wood relocated in the 60s because it wasn't large enough, Abbey Road. And now, of course, St John's Wood is still an extremely active synagogue. I know from attending there, but nevertheless, it's certainly not full by any means on Shabbat. I can recommend it to you as the place to go for the mother of all Kiddushim. If you're a tourist in London and you need something serious to eat on Shabbat lunch, there's no Kiddush like the St. John's Wood Kiddush. Youth Synagogue, as I said, went through a number of phases. It's now a Hasidic center of the Bobov, beautifully renovated, used the whole time, but in a very different way to how it was used in the past. Some shuls are both relocated and regenerated. So Bronsbury and Willesden, both of which shut down, have come together in a new Bronsbury synagogue. If you look at the way the new synagogues are built, I've got 2 or 3 examples here. This is the new Bronsbury synagogue, which I think is attached now to the Northwest London Jewish Day School. Very modern, bright, but very different to the majestic synagogues of the past. It has Hillman windows here, which came from Cricklewood, but they're not used as windows. They're used as lighted up decorations on the walls, as you can see in this picture. The previous one, I think that must be the Northwest London Jewish Day School. Here you can see the old Willesden synagogue, and that's what the new shul looks like today. Southampton knocked the shul down, built this new version. It's a question of taste, isn't it? Built very much like an American synagogue, not quite my taste, but that's what the Southampton shul, that's the difference between the 2 types of architecture. Ilford Federation moved from Coventry Road in Ilford on the left to a new shul very near to the Beehive Lane United Synagogue today. And to the best of my understanding, it has a daily morning minyan, which the United Synagogue doesn't even have. If I'm wrong, I stand to be corrected, under the leadership of Rabbi David Singer, an old childhood friend of mine who lived in Israel for most of his life. And that's what the Ilford Federation looks like today. Finchley Federation moved down the road and has also built a much more modernistic, sort of Bet Midrash type synagogue. So that's quite common. In a number of provincial cases where the last synagogue is remaining on its feet, in the last few years, the United Synagogue have moved in, and they have, some provincial communities have become part of the United Synagogue: Hull, Southport, Birmingham, Sheffield, Luton, which means that they have resources to function for a very small community. I don't know what the deal is, but I assume that the buildings then become the property of the United Synagogue, so that when they do eventually close down, if they do eventually close down, there are resources available to put into other Jewish interests, whether they be in London or elsewhere. Very important, the transfer of assets. What happens to the books, the windows, the plaques? I like the Hillman windows. Hillman windows have been transferred from Cricklewood to Kenton, from Bayswater to Boreham Wood, from the Western Synagogue to Marble Arch. The Hartog Gallery in the Marble Arch Synagogue, with the closure of the Jewish Museum, is probably the nearest you come to a Jewish museum in London today, with some beautiful artifacts in the Hartog Gallery. The old and the new at St. John's Wood. I love this picture on the left of 2 former chief rabbis, Lord Jakobovitz, Lord Sachs, Zichronam Livracha, standing in front of some of the Hillman windows. It took 60 years, but just this year, this very modernistic new set of windows has been installed in Abbey Road in the old St. John's Wood Synagogue, in the new London Synagogue. And just recently, a few weeks ago, this came up in the press, Brighton and Hove Reformed Synagogue are looking for a way to save their building, or at least the windows of this beautiful synagogue. Woodside Park did a good deal. They took the furniture from the Sunderland Base of Medrash, the windows from Southeast London New Cross. Yes, that's the way we should be recycling synagogue artifacts and furniture. And they now have both of them in their synagogue in Woodside Park, North Finchley. And we have this one of the old Jewish home. Who remembers the old Jewish home? Used to be called the Jewish Home for Incurables. Not a very nice name. A hospice, really. When it shut down, it's the inside was transferred to the Sukkot Shalom Reform Synagogue. It's really quite something which has been preserved elsewhere. Sifrei Torah, United Synagogue has a large depository of Sifrei Torah, which it tends to lend out on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur when it needs overflow minyanim. I brought a few to Israel, to new young communities. Here's one from Notting Hill. Here's one from Ilford Federation. I brought some others from Bristol, from Edinburgh. I'm always open to bringing Sifrei Torah, having them repaired, and giving them to new young communities in Israel who don't yet have the wherewithal for their own Sifrei Torah. And they can then use them and have a connection to communities which have closed in the UK. The plaques just get discarded. A few of them are kept. They occasionally come up in auction. You suddenly find in an auction in an out-of-the-way place, like the top picture a whole selection of plaques from Sunderland, but many of them just get discarded, thrown away, unless people take them home to preserve them. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of plaques, particularly the ones in memory of World War I, World War II. You know, what do we do with them? Synagogues, a number of them been listed. Sharman Kaddish lists the process through which listed synagogues should go. Some are formally listed, such as Egerton Road, such as Blackpool. There is a whole process of getting a synagogue listed. I don't know what the process is, but of course, once they're listed, they can't be demolished. And then it's questionable as to what artifacts you can change and what you can remove. There's a positive and a negative side to it. The positive side is it can't be demolished. The negative side is, of course, it can hold up the sale or what people want to do with the buildings once they buy them. A number of synagogues in outlying communities, beautiful synagogues still exist. Cheltenham, Plymouth, Bristol, very old synagogues, beautiful synagogues still functioning, don't necessarily have large audiences, maybe tourist vacationing audiences. Bristol is undergoing a bit of rejuvenation in recent years, but beautiful old shuls which are still holding their own. Bevis Marks, I don't need to say. I love the picture at the bottom. A few years ago, the installation of Rabbi Dweck as the new Chacham, together with the present chief rabbi, the former chief rabbi, the former ambassador of Israel, Daniel Taub, and Zichronam Livracha, the former chief rabbi, Lord Sachs, and who died just last year, Rabbi Abraham Levy, of the Spanish and Portuguese community. Did you know that at the end of the 19th century, they nearly demolished the Bevis Marks? The elders of the community, who were wealthy people moving up west to the West End, decided they had no need for the Bevis Marks anymore, and they had plans to demolish it until the Amcha, for the local people, protested. They held meetings, and they managed to get this decree rescinded, so the Bevis Marks remains to this day the beautiful synagogue that we know it as. A few synagogues in the East End, Sandys Row, House of Jacob and Commercial Road are still functioning. Sandys Row, very functioning mincha minyan during the week for all the city workers, less so on Shabbat. The top picture someone sent to me, this is the gate of heaven, V'zeh Shar HaShamayim, just some building in the East End. Sandys Row had found in their basement this lovely tablet prayer to the royal family. Edward, Prince of Wales, was Edward VIII, the king who abdicated, and they now have it on display in the Sandys Row Synagogue. World Monuments funded a partial restoration of the Congregation of Jacob Synagogue in Commercial Road. Those of you who have been or have not been should definitely go to visit the synagogue and mausoleum in Ramsgate, which were Montefiore's. It's now doesn't function during the year. Sometimes it's open on Rosh Chodesh. A week after Tisha B'Av, on Tu B'Av, the Yortzeit of Montefiore go to Ramsgate, and you will see buses of thousands of Haredim who come from Manchester, from London, from everywhere. Hakarat Tatov, they come to pray at Montefiore's grave. Ashkenazi Haredim, of course. They come in their thousands on the Yortzeit of Montefiore. Again, a very beautiful shul, which is still in situ. What, ladies and gentlemen, will be with the future of these shuls? All of them functioning. Garnet's Hill in Glasgow, New West End. Hampstead, which underwent a beautiful renovation some years ago. Singers Road, Birmingham, Princes Road, Liverpool. Beautiful, beautiful, majestic cathedral synagogues of a certain era. Not very large communities. Where are they going to be 10, 15, 20 years from now? If they have to close down, what's going to happen to these buildings? I don't know the answer, but I raised the question. And plus ça change. If you want to go over everything I said, see what that great, irreverent, great writer Chaim Bermant had to say about synagogues closing down in the 1990s. He made a strong plea for Stiebels replacing the old synagogues, but basically everything he says there is relevant until this day. So in our conclusions, we have a rich heritage of synagogues. They're no longer being demolished. They're listed. They're easiest to convert to other religious usages. Block of flats, cultural centers. What do we do with the assets? What do we do with the plaques and the signs? We definitely need a second edition of the Lost Synagogues of London. In provincial communities, unlike London, where 70% of the British community live, and 70% of that 70% live in North and Northwest London, there are no alternatives once the final synagogue closes down. There is a need, in my opinion, for a national cross-community federation, United Synagogue, Orthodox, Reform, Masorti, a clearinghouse, so that when shuls close down, if there are other communities around the place who are looking for Sifrei Torah, for books, for windows, for furniture, that should be more accessible to communities everywhere. I started with Beverly Jane Stewart's paintings, and I suddenly found out that Merthyr Tydfil has actually been painted by Lowry. I have no idea where that painting is today, but that's really quite unique to have a Lowry painting of a synagogue. That's just my own connection with synagogues. When I've done with all the Majesty of synagogues, I come home to Meitar and pray in this building. So it's quite, but this is a building which is used 3 times a day. It used to be a bomb shelter. We've now built our own synagogue, very different to the synagogues I research. We have an Anglo-Jewish group in Israel. Last year on Sukkot, we had a big meeting. I apologize about the people in the red shirts in the bottom left picture. But of course, in North London, there are 2 very major temples of prayer, which have undergone demolishing and the building of new places of prayer, where the biggest minyanim in London often gather, and you'll know what I'm talking about. I only wanted to put one of those 2 in, but I was told if I put one in, I must put the other one in. And I want to close. I know I've way gone my time, but allow me another few minutes. I have here the final Adon Olam from the closing of the Egerton Road Synagogue. It'll take about 4 minutes. I apologize for going over my time, but I'm open to discussion and questions for as long as you want. And I'll just put a minute or 2 of this final closing valedictory service from the Egerton Road Shul. I hope you can hear it.
No sound. David, we've got no sound.
Oh, I can hear it. You should be able to hear it.
Switch
Can you hear?
Switch up the sound level.
Can you hear?
No.
No, so I'll just stop it then. It's a beautiful rendition of the old Adon Olam, the final choir, the final service from Egerton Road Synagogue. I apologize for going over my time. I still did it quite quickly, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm open to questions, comments for as long as you want. I can go on.
Very special.
Okay. Right. That's right.
I'm going to close down my sharing, and then you can see me. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was utterly brilliant. I'd just like to give you a point of information about the Manchester Jewish Museum, having visited it very recently. The synagogue, like all these other ones you mentioned, is in an area where everyone has moved on. But the museum recently had a lottery grant, and all the exhibition stands were taken out of the synagogue into a brand new building, which is absolutely brilliant. And the synagogue has been restored to its former glories. It is anyone that's in Manchester is worth a visit. It's absolutely fabulous. Anyway, that's just a point of information. I think you've given us such an absolutely fantastic, explanation. I think we will stay on if people can.
I'm open.
But just a couple of questions. Now, if anyone has got a question, and I had loads and loads and loads of comments, but I haven't got any questions. If anyone has an actual question that requires an answer, perhaps you could just raise your hand and I'll come over to you. Any questions? I'm sure there are hundreds of questions. Right. Alex Klein, would you like to ask away?
Yeah. What happens if a synagogue that's been taken over and it's got a preservation order on it, and it's used like there's the High Crumpsall Synagogue is my example, which is a synagogue in Manchester, which was bought by a Haredi group of people and turned into a yeshiva. They basically use the hall, which is attached to the shul, and the old cottage. But the synagogue, I mean, I talked to Sharman about it. The synagogue is a preservation order and was given a grant and is absolutely in disrepair. It's a tragedy. Can we do anything about it officially or through the right channels? Who would I go to? How would you know? Et cetera, et cetera.
I don't know the official answer, but I do know that when synagogues are listed, it doesn't necessarily mean that nothing can be changed. There are certain parts of like the external structure, like the stained glass windows, like the plaques, but there are certain things which can be changed because otherwise, you know, depends to what extent people are prepared. It makes it more difficult. You know, if you want to put change into offices or flats, that can often make it more difficult. I think, again, I don't know the official answer, but I think normally when preservation orders are put on, it lists very specifically what has to be preserved, and anything else can't be. We know that not all Hasidic Batei Midrashim are kept in the best. Egerton Road is an exceptional example. But one of the two Bobova Rebbes, there are two of them in New York, they split. There's the 45th and the 47th, but one of them came over, invested a huge amount of money in doing up what was already a decaying building, a decaying synagogue. And yes, they put in their mechitza and they did that surreptitious change in the window, but on the whole, it's looked after very well. Is the same true of Grove Lane, Lampard Road, of the shul you're talking about? I don't know. Are they, as long as they are behaving according to what the preservation law says, there's not really much you can.
Well, if it's in disrepair, and it's like the shul in Liverpool, you know, a fabulous shul there.
Greenbank, yeah,
Greenbank. It's just dying its own death, and you know, because yes, it's there, that the outward structure is there, but because of all the vandalism and the rotting and that, you know, it could be preserved. And as you said, you know, recording studios, libraries, research centre, museums, and there's no museums in London, but there are shuls which needs to be maybe resurrected.
Yeah, well, of course, you know, Manchester and London, Salford and Stamford Hill, and if it ever came to that, Northwest London, Golders Green, Hendon, and so on, Edgware today, have Jewish communities who are certain parts of that community are growing and they want new shuls and they want new schools. But in a place like Liverpool or Glasgow, the community is going. I don't know why Greenbank. I mean, has it been because they didn't want to sell it, or because maybe there's a preservation thing there which makes it more difficult for people to buy? I don't know. So I don't really know.
David, the answer basically is the relationship that the communities in the UK have with local authorities and governments aren't the same relationships that they have in Eastern and Western Europe with their governments and their local authorities, where they are forwarding money, you know, for heritage sites and things. Prime example is the Rumbach synagogue in Budapest, which we were there last year, and the government, you know, put in a tremendous amount of money to bring it into its former glory.
We'll go move on. Just want to make one last comment. Comment said, of course, where governments are putting money in because maybe of their guilt feelings, such as places like Hungary, it's one thing. The question that needs to be raised is how much we as a community are prepared to put in. And then there's a question of priorities. What's more important? It's important to preserve. It's important to put money into Jewish education for the future. And it was great to hear a question from you, from Alec, which wasn't about Chazanut.
Thank you, David.
I've got one last question before I turn to Geraldine for the vote of thanks. And it's from Mark Drucker, who says, is it possible to move an old shul to an open-air museum?
Say that again. An old
Is it possible to move an old shul to an open-air museum?
Why an
It means
open air
because
museum?
there are open air museums with with villages created from old houses that have been saved, including churches.
Look, as I said, you can really look, a synagogue is a building, and if there are no preservation orders or heritage orders, you can basically do what you want with that building. There are also halachic questions, of course, but that's more the other way around. Once a synagogue's been deconsecrated, I don't think there are many halachic issues. There is a lot of discussion about whether things that used to be churches or chapels can then be used as synagogues. And I was looking into this last week. There's a whole discussion. And if so, on the whole, the Rabbanim say no to Catholic synagogues. But if they were chapels, and if they've been totally removed of all the Christian sites and so on, then as a second best, they can be. But I don't know whether there's anything about when synagogues close down and are deconsecrated. The basic issue is what Alex brought up, and that is, once there are preservation orders slapped on synagogues, because we don't want them to be destroyed, we don't want those beautiful sites to disappear, it then is the question of what you're allowed to keep and what you're not allowed to keep. But if there are no preservation orders, you can do pretty much what you want to do with it. So, I mean, I'm not saying that in a positive or a negative way, just in a factual way.
Okay, well, I think that's it for questions now, and I'd like to ask Geraldine Alva to propose a vote of thanks to you. Geraldine.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you for this absolutely amazing tour de force. And it's shown us the buildings, but what you've given us is not just the fact that these are buildings. These were buildings with people, and the people had their ideas, and they were the people who wanted this and the people who wanted that. And, this is what has kept Jews going for thousands of years, that there's always been each synagogue is its own little empire, and each one has got its own ideas and its own nusach and its own music and its own community. And, who would ever want to be a rabbi when you've got to deal with all this? But it is an amazing story and of Jews coming, flowering, flourishing, building the most beautiful synagogues and moving on. And, I've had the same thing. I work with people in South Africa who are dealing with hundreds of little communities all across the country that came, built synagogues in the 1900s, 1920s, by the 1970s, finished,
Same story. There were synagogues throughout Wales and Scotland in places you would never dream of.
And exactly, because I've also just been helping Malcolm Wiseman, our Minister for Small Communities, write his autobiography.
Wow,
and
that's going to be
coming out next month. It's called A Wing and a Prayer, because he was an RAF chaplain, and he talks about all the communities, the comings and goings, the building up and the falling down. And, it's just a wonderful story, and you've given us a really wonderful run. I don't know how you managed to do all that in this time. You held us spellbound, and to look at these pictures. And of course, for each synagogue, there's no pattern. Each group of people have to make their own decisions and deal with their own stuff. So long may it continue that there will be people who build synagogues and who then move on and build new synagogues. Thank you so much. I think it's been a wonderful event in the heritage for B'nai B'rith of memory. It's brought up a lot of memories. There's been a wonderful audience here, and I'm so glad that we had this wonderful forum.